So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us from wherever you are. Today is February 13th, 2025. Welcome to our fourth webinar in this series focused on the history of people, forests, and forestry. The series is co-hosted by the Forest School at the Yale School of the Environment and the Forest History Society. My name is Gary Dunning. I am the Executive Director of the Forest School and the Forest Dialogue, both based here at the Yale School of the Environment in New Haven, Connecticut, in the US. I'm one of the hosts of this series, and I will be introducing today's webinar and speaker. Let me also introduce our other co-hosts for the series. They are Professor Mark Ashton. Mark is the Morris K. Jessup Professor of Silviculture and Forest Ecology and the Director of Yale Forest, as well as the Senior Associate Dean of the Forest School here at the Yale School of the Environment. Our other co-host is Tanya Moons. Tanya is the President and CEO of the Forest History Society. Tanya is based in Durham, North Carolina in the US. And Tanya and I are trading off facilitation duties for the series. A little bit more about the series. As all of you know, this Yale Forest Forum webinar series is exploring histories of people, forests, and forestry. And as you can see from this slide, the fantastic slate of speakers and themes that we have lined up for you over the next 4 months or through the end of April. We're really excited about this slate of speakers, and we hope that you will be able to join all of them. I think, again, as most of you know by now, this series convenes on Thursdays from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern US time, and through the end of April. The webinar presentations run roughly 30 minutes or so, with audience Q&A to follow. Please always remember to submit your questions via the Zoom Q&A function. Each session in the series is recorded and will be available on the Yale Forest Forum website shortly after the session. And as always, if you have any questions related to the series or the Yale Forest Forum, you can email us at yff@yale.edu. Now, I'm extremely happy to introduce today's speaker, Meredith Martin. Meredith is an assistant professor in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at North Carolina State University. Her research is focused on forest ecology and silviculture of both timber and non-timber forest products around the world in temperate, subtropical, tropical, and urban environments. Dr. Martin holds a PhD and Master's of Forest Science from the Yale School of the Environment in Forest Ecology and Silviculture, and a BA from Columbia University in Environmental Biology. Prior to joining NC State, Dr. Martin worked as a postdoctoral associate with Yale and the Nature Conservancy studying tropical restoration and reforestation. Meredith will talk with us today about Tembawang as an indigenous silvicultural system. And with that, Meredith, I am happy to hand it over to you. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Let me share my slides. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Gary. I'm really thrilled to be here. As you said, I'm going to be talking about Tembawang, which is an indigenous silvicultural system. But before I get into the specifics of this particular type of management, I wanted to step back and talk a little bit more broadly about silviculture, forest management, and about indigenous management systems more broadly. So silviculture, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the term, is basically the management of forests. There's a lot of different definitions. One that I like is the art and science of tending and producing a forest, because I think that's really describes what we are doing when we are trying to manage forests. So typically, at NC State University, at Yale University, when we are teaching silviculture, I teach a silviculture course. What we're really teaching is this sort of Western silviculture, what's written down in textbooks. This was developed in Germany in temperate conifer forests and then was transplanted all around the world through colonialism and other processes. The focus of conventional silviculture really is timber and to a lesser extent pulpwood, or not to a lesser extent, also pulpwood and paper and things like that, but really it's growing trees quickly. And there's a general worldview that's associated with this that we can think of as sort of a scientific Western worldview where resources are managed as commodities. We assume that resources can be used and managed as if they're limitless, that we can just keep harvesting and it will come back. We have an assumption that humans have dominion over nature, that we can really control what's happening in the forest. And we have this very mechanistic reductionist view that if we can understand all the little pieces of the puzzle, we can put in tweaks here and do fertilizer, all these different things and have ultimate control. This is a system that has worked incredibly well. We have amazingly productive plantation forests throughout North Carolina and all sorts of places, but it's not as good at dealing with uncertainty and surprises. And as we've seen, it's not necessarily a sustainable system all around the world, or for all the sort of products and services that we may want from forests. Indigenous silviculture, by definition, has really developed in situ in the places over thousands of years of trial and error. So these systems are incredibly diverse and incredibly specific to the places where they're from. That being said, researchers and people who study this, Indigenous people themselves, have identified a number of unifying characteristics of these systems. So for one, they tend to focus both on timber and non-timber forest products. A lot of systems focus on fruits and nuts and latexes, medicinal plants, food, things like that. They tend to be much more closely integrated with agriculture. And I know Eduardo Neves talked a bit about Swidden systems, I believe, last week. Everyone should check out that talk if they haven't yet. They tend to be very linked to social ecological systems. So it's not necessarily that there's like a textbook that we're looking at to refer to. A lot of the management is conducted through social norms, social customs, customary practices, and things like that. And they tend to embody long time horizons and have a more sort of holistic understanding of nature. So what I mean by that is a lot of the forest management happens at the seedling stage, as opposed to at the tree stage with chainsaws, as we do in the West, which can mean that sometimes it can be very hard to really see and identify what's happening as an outside observer. So with that in mind, I also want to talk a little bit about the tropics, because I'm going to be talking about a system that's from Indonesia, from incredibly rich tropical forest. And, comparing the ecology of tropical forests to the ecology of Germany, for example, where conventional silviculture was developed, we can see that there's a lot of reasons why it may not transfer super well to the tropics. So one of the main differences is species diversity, right? We know that the tropics are super diverse, but just how much more diverse are they? So these are just a couple of examples of numbers. Across all of Europe, so the entire continent of Europe, there are about 450 native tree species. Canada, the entire huge country of Canada, we have almost 250 tree species. The US, 881 tree species. So, that seems like a lot, right? But then we jump to the tropics. They're estimated to be 40,000, possibly more than 53,000 tree species in the tropics. So not including orchids and ferns and all these herbaceous plants, lianas, just tree species, right? And when we zoom into a country like Indonesia, where the Tembawang systems originated, there are over 5,000 tree species in that country alone. So that is an enormous amount of ecological complexity to be thinking about as a forest manager. The corollary of having a lot of species diversity just overall means that you also have a lot of species diversity in any individual piece of forest. So in the US, we tend to have maybe 2 to 20 tree species per hectare. For those of you in the US, a hectare is about 2.5 acres. But in tropics, it can be way more diverse. There's huge ranges, but one value of 121 tree species per hectare in the Amazon, average of 225 tree species per hectare in East Kalimantan, where some of these Tembawang systems are in Indonesia. And that means that the number of trees of any individual species are just way, way smaller because you physically have to pack a lot more species into the same area. You're going to have fewer trees per species. So in the US, maybe you have 1,000, 2,000 trees per hectare. If you only have 2 species, 3 species, you've got 1,000 trees per hectare of that species that you want. In Malaysia, on the other hand, an average density was found of 0.01 adult trees per hectare. That's really, really small. So you can see how challenging that would be for management if there are particular species that you are using for timber, for fruit, whatever it is. So it's just a very complex system that these indigenous people are working with. So I want to kind of set the stage with that. The other thing that I want to highlight just more broadly about indigenous management systems is there are a couple of different sort of classifications that we can make based on the type of management. Tembawang is considered a type of managed forest. And this is really probably the most understudied and invisible form of indigenous management. Other 2 types that are much more common to talk about are home garden systems and managed fallows. And I want to talk about both of these a little bit because they're kind of key to understanding how Tembawang systems are created. So home garden systems, an example here, these are both photos from Myanmar from a project I did. Here's a gentleman climbing a tree to harvest some coconuts in his home garden. And then on the right, we see recently cleared and burned area that's going to become part of a Swidden managed fallow system. So I'm going to talk through all 3 of these quickly and then get into Tembawang more specifically. So home garden systems are probably the most well-studied of all indigenous management systems. They're found throughout the tropics and subtropics, and basically they're these small tree, multi-canopied areas immediately around people's houses where people are growing a huge range of usually subsistence, but sometimes commercial products. The things that is really notable about these systems is that often they're just incredibly diverse and incredibly complex. So you'll have mixes of multiple tree species, shrub species, climbing vines and lianas, understory species, almost all of which are being used for medicinals, ornamentals, food, timber, fuel wood, and all in a super tiny area. Because they're so sophisticated, they really clearly represent the kind of intricate indigenous knowledge that many people have. And so they've been much more sort of documented and studied, particularly by anthropologists and ethnobotanists interested in learning about indigenous knowledge of plants. And just to give you some numbers here, because I'm saying they're super diverse and complicated, but what does that really mean? So here's a few examples. In Ribereño gardens in the Peruvian Amazon, one study found 168 different species represented in these little home gardens. And they were super diverse within them. So 90 of those species were just found in one garden, not necessarily across all. In Huastec Maya gardens, Janice Alcorn found 182 different species being cultivated. And in a study that I worked on with Mark Ashton, one of our hosts in Sri Lanka, we found 219 total species in these gardens with a mean and average of 64 species per garden, which is just astonishing. Any of you who are gardeners or are managing your own backyard to think about understanding the ecology and management of a handful of species, let alone 60, is kind of mind-boggling. And even though these are super small individually, maybe a quarter of a hectare, together they actually encompass a fair amount of land. So in our study, about 3/4 of all households were maintaining a home garden. And so collectively it covered almost a fifth or more than a fifth of the total land area. So these can be really substantial systems. The other thing that I wanted to highlight here, just in terms of silvicultural complexity, this is a figure from our study. And so we have here on the, I hope you can see my arrow, on the y-axis, the density, the number of trees per hectare. And on the y-axis, we have the height of each tree. And we have a number of different species shown here. See this, with everything from sort of coconut to mango, rambutan, different things. And I want to just highlight as an example this Reka catechu. This is betel nut. This is a palm that's really found in the overstory. So it can be a really big tree, 21 meters, 20 meters, 19 meters. This is this one with dots in it. But you'll see that in these home gardens, it's not just growing in the highest, up in the upper canopy. There are these dotted bars, these Reka catechus, throughout the entire distribution, which means that these gardeners, these silviculturalists are continually reproducing these different species. So they are maintaining a continuous sustainable cycle. And if any of you have worked in like plantation management or traditional forestry, the idea of having a sort of selection system or some sort of management system where you are continuously producing one species is hard, but 10, 12, 14, 30 species at one time is really just pretty incredible. And again, you can see down here the sort of complex structure. This is copa-cola, which is a leaf is cooked sort of like spinach. We have these palms, so we have just this multi-layered canopy, and the sort of knowledge that goes into the shade tolerances, the ways that different species can be regenerated or coexist is pretty astonishing in these systems. Shifting over to managed fallows, these have a number of different names. Swidden systems, shifting cultivation systems. A more derogatory term is maybe slash and burn, which most folks have probably heard of. And so this is a system where a part of the forest is cut, burned, annual crops are grown for a few years. And then as the nutrients in the system begin to be depleted, most annual crops are very demanding in terms of how much nutrients they need to grow. The area is left fallow. It's left to regrow natural vegetation. That fallow period can be short or long before the system is sort of put back into annual agriculture. And the thing I want to highlight about these managed fallows is these can be really managed beyond the agricultural phase. And so we're going to talk with the Tembawang about ways in which these systems are enriched and the trees that grow back in these areas are really managed. And so it's a really interesting example of this combination, this much closer relationship between agriculture and forestry that we see in these systems. The other thing that I want to highlight, I think, slash and burn obviously has a really bad reputation. The term slash and burn sounds really terrible, cutting down rainforest and so forth. And Swidden is a kind of a key part of the Tembawang system. So I do want to highlight the ways in which this type of management, shifting cultivation, can actually be fairly well suited to some of these tropical areas. Indonesia in particular has pretty poor soil quality, very old soils. And so without, it's really hard to have permanent agriculture there that's going to be sustainable without a lot of artificial inputs like fertilizers and herbicides and all of these different things that we've developed in conventional Western agriculture. And so this sort of shifting cultivation managed fallow system is a way of really using ecology as a subsidy. So letting the area regrow is a way of building the soil back. You get a lot more nutrients, organic matter, and different things deposited onto the soil as the fallow vegetation grows. And so then when you come back around to that same area for agriculture, you've gotten this sort of subsidy from the forest in terms of replenished nutrients. It also can create a really interesting landscape mosaic of different ages of forest succession, which can be really valuable for a number of wildlife species and can also really increase the overall biodiversity of an area. So the sort of beta diversity, the heterogeneity of the area is really potentially increased by this system. Giving the forest a chance to regrow, again, provides wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, nutrient replenishment, all these different things that you don't necessarily get with permanent agriculture. That being said, these systems can be skillfully applied or not. what we have often seen in places where they become destructive is when groups have perhaps been shifted off of their traditional territories or have lost area, and so the fallow period has to shrink in order to accommodate increases in populations or decreases in access to forest area. And that can really make the system less sustainable. But the other thing is that a lot of efforts to eliminate shifting cultivation can actually lead to more permanent land conversion. And so if you look at sort of some of the land use alternatives that we have, right, cattle farming, that's permanent agriculture, so it's not shifting cultivation, it's not slash and burn per se, but this is a way more dramatic, way more destructive transformation of the landscape than shifting cultivation ever is. And in Indonesia, where we're going to be focusing on the shift towards palm oil plantations, is just increasing dramatically 1 million acres per year from 1997 to 2006 in Indonesia alone. In more recent years, we did have a bit of a decline during the COVID pandemic, but picked back up. And if you look at this landscape, you know, in terms of any of the ecosystem values that we think about, this is going to be way less biodiverse, as we'll see, less carbon, less wildlife habitat. All of these different things are really sometimes much more damaging to have a kind of shift away from traditional practices towards these more permanent agricultural settings. So managed forests and Tembawang systems are can arise through sort of 3 different pathways. One is through the development of home gardens, so multiple home gardens that are then sort of combined and developed into a more mature forest system. Another is through extending a managed fallow, so in the shifting cultivation Swidden system, extending the fallow period and enriching that system and really turning it into a managed forest. And the third is through silvicultural treatment of intact forest. From what we understand, Tembawang systems really are through the first 2 processes. So part of the shifting cultivation cycle becomes enriched and turns into these managed forests. This is a photo of a Tembawang system on the right here. And I want to pause, and I know this is a lot of text, and so I apologize, but I want to read this quote from one of my mentors' books, Chuck Peters, Managing the Wild. This is about his first experience in coming across a Tembawang system while he was working in West Kalimantan. And so in his telling, he used to drive on, as part of his research site, he was constantly passing this hill forest that just looked incredibly beautiful. And so one time he stopped to speak to one of the local people there and asked to see the forest. And so the guide took him through, and he says, "The forest was relatively open, yet multi-storied, with numerous palms and climbers. Many of the canopy trees were heavily buttressed and over 1 meter in diameter. After noticing a few durian husks on the ground, I asked about some of the trees around us. My host knew them all, and he also knew when they produced fruit, how many baskets of fruit they yielded, what the market price for the fruit was last year, and roughly how old the trees were. And then he told me the name of the person who had planted each tree. To my untrained eye, I appeared to be in a beautiful, relatively undisturbed piece of mixed dipterocarp forest. How had these people created such a marvelous homemade forest?" So I'm going to shift now to talking more specifically about Tembawang. And some of the key points that I want to highlight here are one, the sort of incredible sophistication of this system, such that it can be mistaken for a native forest, even by a forest ecologist working in Indonesia. And then I also want to sort of touch on this point of the invisibility of these systems and the kind of importance of trying to get a bit more recognition potentially on these systems and the damage that we get when these are lost. So Tembawang are a form of managed forest, sometimes called forest gardens, by the Dayak indigenous groups in Indonesia. So we are looking primarily at the island of Borneo here. Borneo is partially Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. And the Dayak people are really in the sort of south central parts of Indonesia. The term Dayak was kind of a catch-all for more inland indigenous people, actually by the Dutch colonizers. And so actually multiple tribes and multiple languages are sort of encompassed by the term Dayak. Many of these groups, though, have really embraced that term. Traditionally, they were swidden cultivators and somewhat nomadic. So they would move, depending on the group, every 10 years or more from place to place. One of the main features of Dayak communities were longhouses called lamen. Here's an old photo of a longhouse. And the longhouses are kind of central to both the Dayak culture, but also were kind of key to the creation of Tembawang systems. So these are a few photos of what these longhouses can look like. They generally were incredibly long, so hundreds of feet long, and the entire community would live in the longhouse, up to some estimates, hundreds of people. So there would be a central communal corridor, and then everybody would have sort of individual apartments off the sides. The specific longhouse construction varied from region to region, but really this was kind of the main political unit for the tribe was the longhouse that you belonged to. And that was sort of the primary allegiance. And, again, they could be from 400 meters, 200 meters long. So these really impressive structures, all hewn by hand traditionally. And so as part of their shifting cultivation, the Dayak people are primarily shifting cultivators for rice. And so they would clear area of forest, use some of the timber to build the longhouse, the beams and posts primarily made of ironwood that might be sort of brought from place to place because it's very rot resistant. And then they would clear areas of forest to cultivate rice. After a few years, these areas would start to lose fertility. Again, Indonesia, really not amazing soil fertility. And at the same time, the fruits and nuts and other species that they planted around or as part of these fallows would start to shade out the rice fallow. And so the timing would be such that by the time their different fruit trees are starting to shade out the fallow, it's sort of time to let that rice system transition into something else, have a period to regroup its nutrients. And so this is a diagram of what sort of this process can look like. So you have a high forest. The forest is cut and burned, and annual crops are planted here, in this case, rice. But it also, other species are planted here as well. For the Tembawang system, one of the main keystone species is durian, which we'll talk about more in a moment, but all sorts of other fruits and nuts, medicinal plants, and other things. And over time, through repeated visits, every time you go to visit the Tembawang to harvest the fruits, you do management at the same time. So selective weeding to remove the unwanted species and to spare the species that you do want. And this sort of continuous planting of new seeds, and over generations, you wind up with this improved tree fallow, this forest system that to the untrained eye looks like a native forest, but is really enriched in the type of species that you want. And so I'll explain a little bit more what this looks like. So the main keystone species for this system is durian. There are many recognized species of durian, but Durio zibethinus is the main commercial one. But again, there are tons of varieties, more than 100 varieties in Indonesia. Durian, those of you who don't have any experience of durian, it's an incredibly unique fruit. People say it tastes like sort of chemical onion, creamy custard. It's very hard to describe, but folks who like it really, really love it. And it's got a huge global market. The best estimate that I could find was $24 billion globally. I'm not sure exactly where that calculation come from, but at the very minimum, definitely almost $7 billion just in exports to China alone. So this is a really valuable market crop, but also incredibly important to local communities. In the map here, you can see it's native to Indonesia, Malaysia, and has been exported to these purple areas where it's being grown as well. Another keystone species in this system is a lipe nut, also called Tembawang. This is a Shuria species. This is a species that is used to make a sort of like a cocoa butter almost. It's can be used in cosmetics for commercial uses, but also for food and all sorts of different things. The nice thing about a lipe nut is a complement to durian. Durian does not have a very long shelf life, which is one of the reasons we don't get durians in the market so much here in the US. It just doesn't last very long after picking. But a lipe nut is much more sort of shelf stable, and for communities that are more isolated, this becomes more of an important economic product. So those are some of the keystone species that we have. But again, these systems are just incredibly diverse and complicated, just like the home gardens that we talked about initially. So this is a study looking at some Tembawang systems in West Kalimantan. These are some images of what these look like. They found 97 tree species in the Tembawang, with almost 50 tree species diameter greater than 20 centimeters. Now that is an enormous number of tree species to be managing in a system. Another study in 2003 was comparing natural forest, 75 to 105 species of tree. And Tembawang, they did see a decrease in diversity, but still 36 to 70 species, with many of them sort of not planted. So a range of kind of these native species that are part of natural regeneration, as well as these really important keystone species. Chuck Peters in his work found a range of 56 to 125 different species in the Tembawangs that he looked at. And again, we're seeing a mix of these sort of native volunteer species, but also durian, rambutan, mangosteen, rattan, all these other really key, valuable species. And even in the study that sort of found, well, 77% are non-planted. Of the planted species, they did find 30 different species that were being planted. So again, if you think about any sort of plantation system that you may be familiar with, the idea of planting and managing 30 different species at the same time is, again, just incredibly impressive. And so I wanted to just kind of demonstrate quickly also, Chuck, in wandering around, said he thought this looked like a completely natural forest. And I wanted to just really kind of show how true that is. So here I've got two images of tropical forest. The one on the right is the Tembawang, and the one on the left is just a natural Amazonian rainforest. And you can see in both, we have these really complicated multi-strata canopy, really high species diversity. Here's another example. This is Tembawang in West Kalimantan, and again, Amazon rainforest. I was just there, so I threw these pictures in. But the idea that you would walk into this and think, oh, well, this is an agroforestry system that is being carefully managed, it really is quite invisible to outside perspectives. Now, I want to highlight, right, these are incredibly diverse natural looking systems, but that doesn't mean that there haven't been dramatic impacts in management. So this was some work done by Chuck Peters, where he was part of a forest inventory project. They put in random plots in what they thought was intact dipterocarp forest in West Kalimantan. And he ran an analysis looking at the species composition of these different plots. And he found this very strong division. So this is dividing the sort of forest communities, species compositions that he found. A very clear division between forest that was just completely dominated and enriched by these red useful species, by durian, by artocarpus, breadfruit, by mangifera, mangoes, by rambutans, all of these different things, and forest that just really wasn't, right? And so basically what he was coming across was all these hidden tembawangs in the forest system. Another way of looking at this is a study in 1995, looking at the density of these useful species in fruit garden, that's the Tembawang system, compared to primary forest. And so in primary forest, remember, right, we have these super diverse forests. And so you get one to two durian, 1 to 2 Alipe nut trees per hectare. But in the fruit gardens, in the Tembawangs, we've got 43 durians per hectare, 13 Alipe nuts per hectare. So the management has been incredibly effective at really increasing the density of durian in these systems. And that's through this combination of initial planting, but also through this continuous tending. So that every time people go out to harvest durian, there's a harvest season. This is a photo of folks camping out in the forest, waiting for the durian to be ripe. Again, there's a very short window when they're ready. And so while there, people are continuously tending the Tembawang, the forest garden, and continuously contributing to this sort of enrichment that happens. The other thing that I want to highlight is here, just as in that home garden, these are diameter size classes on the bottom and number of trees on the y-axis. And we see, again, in these systems that not only are they maintaining these sort of adult trees that were initially planted, but they're managing continuous regeneration of these species, meaning that this really is a system that could keep sort of perpetuating into the future with continued management. Really, really very impressive. The other thing to note here is that while these Tembawang, excuse me, do have lower species diversity compared to sort of overall primary forest, the composition is in many ways quite similar in terms of the successional stages of different species. So this was a study looking at different ages of Tembawang compared to natural forest. And they found lots of late successional species in these Tembawangs, again, because many of these are the species that are being managed for fruits and nuts and things. But when we compare these again, really to any other sort of plantation system, they're just so much closer to natural forest, right, as we saw from those photos, but also in terms of other ecosystem services. So one study I found comparing above ground biomass, in other words, the amount of carbon, found almost more than twice as much carbon stored in these Tembawang systems compared to conventional rubber plantations, for example. And so, you know, just from a species diversity perspective, of course, these Tembawang systems offer way more ecosystem services than a monoculture rubber plantation, but also from these sort of carbon and other ecosystem service perspectives as well. So these systems are incredibly ecologically complicated, incredibly skillfully applied, but they are not solely ecological systems, right? They are very deeply linked social ecological systems. And so they only exist because of these complex customs around, this is a ritual around entering the Tembawang, traditional ritual, but also these complex systems of management. So many of the Tembawang trees are either individually owned initially, but then they become passed on and sort of kinship owned. So descendants of the initial planter then has the right to continue to harvest fruit from these individual trees. Sometimes areas are communally managed, but even though they have this sort of interesting individual management, individual sort of ownership structure, the whole Tembawang system is all a single continuous area. And so it's a physical place where the community has this sort of history. One of the values that folks, particularly Will DeJong, have highlighted is that these systems also really help to maintain kinship bonds because, you know, there'll be multiple generations past that have been managing these Tembawangs that have owned the rights to harvest these alipe nuts or these durians. And so, of course, as generations go, the number of people with those rights increases, as they go, my grandfather planted this one, my great-grandfather planted this one. And so there's a way of really maintaining these kinship bonds, and also this real sense of identity and connection to the land. So, I was thinking the Forest History Society is a co-leader of this workshop about the way that these Tembawang systems are this sort of physical, biological indicator of the people's history of both where the longhouses were over time as they moved from place to place, but also a history of sort of these individual families and ownership structures and kinship over time. I know we're getting close to time. I only have a little bit left. The other thing that I want to highlight about this sort of social ecological system is the complex traditional knowledge that is part of this. And so these are a couple examples of classifications of different land use that different tribes use. And these are fairly complicated diagrams, but I just want to highlight, right, there are different names, for example, for a Swidden system that has been cleared once, cleared twice, cleared at least 3 times. There's a different word for an old secondary forest. There's a different word for a secondary forest with shrubs, and from an extremely degraded secondary forest, or from a new fallow. And so the sort of knowledge and naming of these distinctions in terms of these secondary successional forests, the species composition, the level of fertility and degradation, is an enormous amount of knowledge, and as we're moving into thinking about forest restoration, forest degradation, the amount of insight that's contained even just in these indigenous terms is really impressive and really, really valuable. But, the systems are not only kind of invisible in the landscape, they're also really not very well studied. So in preparation for this talk, I was, looking for additional literature to add. I looked at Web of Science and found 3 results focused on Tembawang. Google Scholar, almost 600 results, which sounds like, oh, well, that's a lot. But if you compare it to agroforestry, 500,000 results, home gardens, 10,000 results, Slashenberg agriculture, 200,000 results. We're really, really lacking in a lot of research about these systems. And so, like what is distinguishing the understanding of a secondary forest, an old secondary forest, an area that's been cleared once or twice? The anthropologists and folks have sort of documented these details, but from an ecological perspective, we really are missing an opportunity to learn a lot from these systems. And the future of these systems is kind of unclear. This was a study in 1994, they found, a lot of the land was being managed as Swiddens, as fallows, and as Tembawang systems. But by 2006, when this other study was done, there were still Tembawang present, but they were all being reduced in size. There was a lot of pressure to shift towards oil palm conversion, and a lot of people were shifting to sort of wage labor and not practicing shifting agriculture anymore. And, these systems are all really linked. So this is a photo from Kalimantan, and you can see the rice paddies in the front. You can see a house here with a home garden with palms and different things. And in the back, you can see these Tembawang forest systems. And so as home gardens decline, as Swidden agriculture is eliminated, as there's more pressure for commercialization, more palm oil pressure, things like this, it seems very likely that many of these systems are going to continue to decline. And with that, all of the sort of ecological knowledge and really incredible silvicultural skill will also disappear. So I think that as my sort of, I guess, final takeaway is just that I'm really so thrilled that the Yale Forest Forum is spending so much time focused on these indigenous management systems, because they are so incredibly valuable. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Meredith. That was really fascinating. We're going to jump right into the questions if that's okay with you.
Yeah,
We have,
sorry, I went over.
but no, it's right. We have a bunch. We have about 15 minutes, so we'll get through as many as we can. And as always, apologies to folks if we're not able to get to your question. We will do as many as we can. I actually was thinking while you were talking, are you aware of any study or a general kind of accepted figure of hectares per person for a Tembawang system? When we think about the modern world and communities or villages or groups of indigenous people wanting or continuing their traditional practice, what extent of area generally can we use? Do you have a figure or is there
That's a
research?
really great question. And to my knowledge, I think it probably varies from place to place, but
Sure.
I don't think that I haven't seen a lot of specific numbers. There are some estimates, but a lot of this work comes out of sort of geographers, political ecologists looking at sort of impacts of different programs, and there's less sort of ecological silvicultural forest management work going into sort of calculating some of these more ecological features. At least that's what I've seen for sure. And I think that social political side is super important, and kind of seeing how these dynamics are playing out is incredibly important. But I think we are really missing some of those other things.
Thanks for that. And this is maybe a message to any of the researchers out there. As land back movements build, if we had a figure like that was largely scientifically accepted, it'd be very helpful. Sorry, moving on to the other questions. For shifting cultivation systems, are there typically differences in the forest that grows back versus the original forest? This person adds, my impression had been that since most nutrients in tropical forests are in the living biomass rather than the soil, the land gets easily degraded after clearing.
Yeah,
Thoughts
so
on
that's
that?
a great question. And I think, for a long time, I think there wasn't nearly as much research into looking into what actually happens with shifting cultivation, and a lot of work just on trying to condemn it. It does seem that after a decent amount of time in fallow, a lot of the nutrient levels really come back to where they were, which is kind of amazing and a bit of a mystery where some of those nutrients are coming from in a way. And so, it's really different if we're talking about like a 20-year fallow system and if we're talking about like a 3-year fallow period. And so definitely short fallow systems, there is evidence that, for example, the seed bank becomes depleted after your repeated burning, and so you're losing some of those species. Certainly there's the potential, depending on where you are, to if the fallow period is too short, and particularly with certain like invasive species, you might shift to some of these invasive fern kind of dryland systems that are really hard to get back from. But I think a lot of what we see in shifting cultivation now is not necessarily representative of how the systems were designed to be. So in my understanding, many of these Tembawangs were not necessarily clearing actually primary forest, right? It's a lot harder to cut down huge meter wide trees, particularly if you don't have a chainsaw, than it is to cut down a 20-year-old forest. And so, some of those terms about how many times an area has been cleared really refers to this concept that these systems were being created on existing secondary forests. So I think that's one thing. And we've seen, in a lot of places, groups have been forced to move or shifted into smaller land areas. And so the fallow period becomes shorter, and you're much more likely to have this type of degradation. Or a group is moved to an area that they are not from, and they don't have actually the local ecological indigenous knowledge that another group may have. So all of those are issues that we see now.
Okay. All right. Here's a question. It's a very interesting one, a basic one. How do forests have such rich plant species diversity with such poor soil quality?
That is a great question. And, why do tropical forests have such high plant diversity has been something that ecologists have looked at for a very long time. And there's lots of theories about it. One thing is that nutrient levels and species are, you'd think they might be related, but not necessarily, right? You can have a very nutrient-rich system, and one species is just really, really good at growing there and is completely dominant. So we tend to think of productivity as being inherently linked to richness, and it doesn't necessarily have to be. Theories around why tropical forests are so diverse have to do with, um, the impacts of pests and diseases. When you don't have a winter to kind of knock back pests and diseases, those can become much more important, and so it can be biologically beneficial to not be next to other individuals of the same species so that you avoid the pests and diseases. That's called negative density dependence. It's a sort of more accepted theory of some of the drivers of biodiversity. But also we see, a lot more sort of animal dispersal, a lot more interactions between insects and pollinators. In the temperate zones, almost everything is wind pollinated, wind dispersed. And so it seems probably likely that some of those more intricate relationships are able to develop in maybe areas without cold winters where the insects are around all the time, and that probably drives some increase in diversity too. But it's a complicated evolutionary and ecological question.
And obviously, the diversity of wildlife also has an impact as it spreads. The more wildlife there is, the more it will spread. And obviously, not to disregard human impact, as we've seen with these Tembawang systems are so much more diverse, based compared to some local forests. So, yeah. Here's probably the foundational question of this entire series and where we go with the next series next fall. So I'm going to ask you to comment.
Great.
Has interaction with colonization by Europeans affected these agroforestry systems in any way?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely in all sorts of ways, right? And some of them in sort of surprising, unexpected ways. So, the introduction of rubber, for example, rubber is from South America, and the theft of rubber seeds by Henry Wickham is probably the greatest example of biopiracy in the history of the world, in World War II, or World War I. And so, a lot of these systems have been kind of amazingly adaptable in terms of incorporating new species into them. So you get these sort of rubber put into some Tembawangs. You get, in that home garden study in Sri Lanka, a lot of those species were not native. People are growing avocado and all sorts of different things, and yet maintaining really interesting diversity. So in some cases, you can get these new species, new products in there that actually can kind of enrich and diversify the systems. So I don't want to say that it is all entirely bad. But this sort of drive towards monoculture, the kind of capitalist market pressures, all of these things push towards monoculture intensification and away from more diverse, subsistence-based kind of resilient systems. And that's a real problem to grapple with. And then, of course, in colonization, we also have loss of tenure rights and people being forcibly moved and disease and all sorts of other really negative consequences. So, yeah, for sure, lots of impacts is the short answer, mostly bad.
So we're going to flip this question a bit. Sarah asks, what practices might be beneficial and transferable for our Western approach to silviculture? Or is the focus and diversity aspect so different that it's irrelevant?
Yeah, I think that's a fabulous question, and one that we should be really asking more of. I was involved in looking at restoration, and all of these organizations are interested in planting forests, reforesting. Agroforestry is a big area of development, potentially way to maximize carbon and all these different things. And so I think that looking at how people are managing these systems, at the species compositions, at the methods that they're using, would be incredibly valuable. But I think before we do that, I think we also really need to give more recognition and support to folks that are already doing this well. I think we often tend to jump to kind of what can we take and spread over the world. And a lot of our kind of mechanisms, carbon offsets, additionality, REDD+, are all kind of geared toward how can we get people who are doing things badly to stop, which is obviously important. But I think the flip side is how can we support people who are doing this really well and help them to keep doing it? So these farmers that are maintaining 125 species per hectare, like, let's support them. Let's give them accolades. Let's find ways to find out what they need to kind of keep doing these practices and not just focus on the people who are doing it badly, because I think that's the way to lose all this knowledge. And so I really think that we need to shift to also supporting people who are already doing it well.
Awesome. Thanks for that. We're going to couple ownership related questions. Is there some documentation of ownership of the different Tembawangs, or is it just understood through community kin structures?
That's a great question. So I think in terms of the individual trees, that's just local knowledge. People know that was my grandfather's tree, and me and all my cousins have the right to harvest that, and everybody knows that, you know, that's his. In terms of more broader governmental recognition of, you know, this whole area is a Tembawang, I think that's mixed. It seems that there are starting to be some projects that are trying to work towards preserving these systems, but you know, land tenure in many of these countries is really complicated, and often communities don't have particularly secure land tenure. So I think there is some documentation now of particular sort of Tembawang locations and trying to protect them. But overall, in terms of like, if somebody wants to put an oil palm concession there, it's a tricky fight, and the sort of legality of tenure. I'm not an expert in Indonesian land tenure law, but I think it's a bit of a mix, basically. And some of these papers, the one that was the 96, the Astiani 2016 paper with 96 species, that was a third generation Tembawang. So those trees had been planted by, you know, the great grandfather, and people were still knew whose was which family, and maintaining those ties and those understandings of community and kinship through that.
Okay. Maybe time for one or two more. Maggio asks, Dr. Peters offers an example of the invisibility of Tembawang forest systems. Western ecologists and foresters tend not to appreciate the management complexity of these silvicultural systems. Why are these systems less studied than home gardens and managed fallows? Do we study home gardens and managed fallows because they are more closely resemble industrial silviculture systems?
Yeah, that's a great question, Maggio. So no, home gardens do not at all resemble traditional plantations, but they are right around people's houses. And so the first people to study home gardens, again, were not ecologists, not foresters. It was anthropologists and ethnobotanists who were going to interview indigenous groups and to say, you know, tell me what medicinal plants you use. And folks would say like, oh, well, I use these ones, and like, they're right here. Do you want to come look? And then they'd walk out back of the house, and then they'd realize like, oh, wait, and you also have these fruits, and this is where you get your this. And that's how they started to be known. And so, you know, they're incredibly accessible. And again, most of the early work was by ethnobotanists, anthropologists, not by ecologists. And these forest systems are just more invisible to the naked eye if you don't know to ask about them. You know, obviously the managed fallows are there's a big burned patch. And so they became an easy focus and often a very vilified focus. But these other systems are much trickier.
All right, let's try to fit in one more. Hopefully we can cover this one quickly. This is from Gerhard. Under pressure from oil palm plantation expansion, what household factors and land characteristics influence farmers to maintain the Tembawang managed systems, if any?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I think something that we should study more. So another paper that I put in the end there was really kind of looking at these five villages and trying to figure out like what was what was driving these changes. And in many cases, the heads were really trying to maintain the Tembawang, had banned further conversion of Tembawang. And so they were trying to sort of maintain what they had. The problem was because shifting cultivation was depleting, they're not sort of growing new Tembawang to replace it eventually, right? These trees are long-lived, they last a long time, but eventually they will die. So it does seem like that system was coming to an end. But you know, it's variable. When Chuck was doing his work in the 90s, he worked in one village that was quite close to Pontianak, which was the capital, and that Tembawang, as you would expect, only, you know, lower species diversity, only 56 species compared to the super rural, really far away 125 species. You know, and he kind of would ask, like, well, why are you still maintaining 50 species? Why don't you just go to pure durian, right? This is your main market. And even with durian, why are you maintaining all these other varieties? Why not just like the commercial one? And people had all sorts of different answers of like, well, my grandma really likes these like rock hard green mangoes, and so we keep them, and we like the taste of the kind of different durian varieties. And you know, I think we forget it's like why do we grow weird ornamentals or have how, you know, office plants of different types? It's because we like them, right? Indigenous people are humans who just like having the skill and the knowledge and the collection of plants that they have, right? So, and I think the question is, how do we reward that? How do we encourage that and not just focus on kind of bad actors?
That's great, Meredith. I think we'll leave it there. I want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us about Tembawang systems, and I know I learned a lot. So thank you
Yeah, thank you so
for
much. My
doing this.
pleasure.
For folks sticking around just for a minute, a reminder that the recordings of today's presentation will be available within several days on the Yale Forest Forum website. This slight delay allows us time to accurately caption each session, making them more accessible to everybody. Slides will also be made available, and when possible, referenced documents or readings will be linked or listed on the Yale Forest Forum website. So please check back on the YFF website. And continue to join us for more in this series on Thursdays from 12 to 1 Eastern US time. Next week, we'll hear from Jonathan Padway. Jonathan's based at the University of Hawaii. Jonathan's talk is titled Culture and Silviculture, Forests and Forest Societies of the Ammonite Mountains of Cambodia and Vietnam.